Hello and welcome to today's session on quantitative research methodologies. My name's Dr. Amanda Lee and I've been tasked to, with this session, to try and get you to have a bit of a critical awareness and understanding of quantitative methodology and data analytics. So I'll just go through some of the aims and objectives that I want to try and do today for this session. But please feel free to access some of the additional reading, and as with anything, today's session is not just necessarily about me being able to impart absolutely every single piece of information that you will need, but to try and signpost you to the right areas to be able to find and seek your own most appropriate sort of advice and resources to be able to help you to learn most effectively. So, the aims and objectives of this session, really I want to try and give you information, knowledge and resources which will help you to start to critically appraise a quantitative research paper. So what I'm going to try and do first of all is just to give you an overview of key methods in quantitative research. So what types of things do we do? How do we start to answer the questions that we set ourselves? How do we identify a quantitative paper in the first place? And how can we start to answer the quantitative questions? Then I'm going to start looking at the mechanisms of collection of data, the mechanisms of measurement of that data, those data, and how do we analyse those data as well in quantitative research. So I'm going to go over data collection, statistical analyses, and how we present and interpret findings. And then I'm also going to try and just signpost you to the further resources that you can actually find on the internet. There's a number of different fantastic resources, certainly on YouTube and StatsWeb and a couple of other places as well, which I'll just put forward at the end of this lecture. So I hope you enjoy it. Many nurses always think that statistics is not something for them, and it was certainly something that I thought to start with. In fact, my PhD started as a Heideggerian hermeneutic phenomenological paper. I soon changed that when I realised that answering questions with numbers is nice, it's easy, it's simple, it's rigorous, and it offers a way that we can generate data from a high number of people, which makes the results more reliable and transferable to other places. So before we start, I just want to try and discuss with you what we mean by something called a theoretical preposition. Before we start to think about any questions at all that we want to try and answer with research, we try and think about what that question is, how we sit ourselves in the truth and in where we sit in an approach to be able to make us to be able to answer the research question. That's called the theoretical preposition. So it sets that conceptual model. It sets the how am I going to answer, how am I going to define my question, how am I going to articulate the problem, look at that problem and analyse that problem to get some type of answer or outcome which is going to be meaningful and appropriate to that question in the first place. So what we're trying to do is, what's the problem or the issue or the question that we have? What are we trying to answer, and then how are we going to justify the approaches that we take to be able to answer that question, the problem or issue. Now, quantitative research design tends to sit on a deductive reasoning. So we sit there, we have a theoretical framework, we have an X, we'll have an impact on Y, or some type of reason or rationale or scientific rationale that will mean that we can make an assumption about what we're doing at the time. That tends to be based on something called a systematic literature review. So we look at all available literature and evidence which grounds our question, tells us what we know already about the subject, and then we can move on from there. So then we can sit on a theoretical preposition that X will have an impact on Y, or that this drug is better than that drug, or that this is the way we're going to answer a specific question. Now, the most important thing is to make sure in any research whatsoever that if you are asking a question, that your conclusions that you're going to reach are derived from the methodology and the actions that you've taken to answer that research. So here what we're trying to do is I'm trying to give you a bit of an idea about what the difference is between quantitative and qualitative research is about. Quantitative tends to deal with numbers, statistics, it analyses, it objectifies a question, it uses the positivist approach, which means that only phenomena and knowledge that's been confirmed by the senses can genuinely be warranted by knowledge. So what positive approach is just we look at theories, we look at hypotheses, and we make sure that we can test and retest those types of things. We measure, we collect, we look at all of the variables that are associated with the thing to be able to deliver a theory of that thing. We can describe, for example, if we use that question, what is cancer? We can describe how many people live with cancer. We can categorise how many people, how many men live with cancer, how many women there are, what populations, what genetic backgrounds these people have, what types of cancer do people have. So it's really important for us to get a big overview, and we know from those types of populations that we can perhaps infer that the next level of populations are likely to have that particular type of cancer as well. Take gastroesophageal cancer, for example, cancer of the head, neck and throat. It is more common in males than it is females. So with that in mind, with the quantitative statistics that show us that that is the case, that we have a ratio of 2/3 men, 1/3 women with this particular cancer, we can infer that populations of higher males are more likely to get gastroesophageal cancer. We can correlate, we can look to see what types of attributes people share, we can group things together and we can see how that works. We can infer, so we can start to look at extent of diagnoses across populations. We can evaluate emerging themes, patterns in data to infer something is likely to happen in similar populations. We can compare, and this is where you get your randomized controlled trials and a number of other sort of quasi-experimental and experimental design studies, which are there to compare, to look at experiments, to see which is the most effective drug or treatment, how often something occurs. Gives us really good, theoretically sound data to be able to identify what is going on and experiment. If this happens, then this will happen. So that's what quantitative analysis does. Now, Dr. Claire Whitfield's more into the qualitative and she'll explain this in far more detail than I can, but this is just a quick overview. When you compare something like a question which is what is cancer, you wouldn't ask that in a qualitative interview, a qualitative study. It would be, how do people live with their cancer? How do they feel about their cancer? How do they survive? What do the tumour and diagnosis make sense? How do they make sense of those tumours and diagnosis? How do we describe, how do people describe and populations describe those cancers? What are the stories of the people who have these particular types of cancers? Or how do they describe cancer and what can they sort of consider in relation to a cancer diagnosis? And what qualitative researchers do is they code the categories, they code responses from many populations, and they try and identify subcategories and then present a thematic description which captures descriptive information from the feelings, from the experiences of their populations. So this slide is how I am going to take you through this whole rest of the slide processes through quantitative statistics and analysis. It offers you an overview of what you can expect to see in any quantitative research study. We first of all begin with a theory and we start to look at what that theory is. We start to generate data and information about the thing it is we're going to study. And then from that data, we know what types of variables we need to add, what types of things we need to look at to be able to study a bit more effectively in quantitative statistics. I'm then going to take you through to how we generate a hypothesis and a null hypothesis, and I'm going to talk about the differences between the two. Then I'm going to take you through how we design a quantitative research study. And there are a number of arms to what is an umbrella term, which is quantitative research methodology. This umbrella term depicts a number of different approaches that we can take. We can either look at experiment, quasi-experiment, descriptive, inference, hypothetico-deductive, epidemiological studies, or a number of other types of studies. And I'm going to talk you through a couple of those that you'll probably come across in health-related data. I'm then going to take you through methods. And the methods is where I'm going to really start to pin down what types of things we do, how we can sort of analyse particular types of data, what methods of data collection we have, how we select population and samples, how we select populations for their representativeness and identify how many people we need to sample to be able to infer something different. The next process is collecting data. And here I'm going to talk to you about how we make sure that we can collect data in numerical terms, and we start to formulate ideas on how we can apportion normal nomenclature into numerical format. Then I'm going to talk to you about analysis of data, and here's where I'm going to start talking about the strange things that you're going to hear in your research papers. Confidence intervals, p-values, mean, median, mode, and a number of the other things that we do. Some of the most common types of statistical analyses that we do, I'm just going to go over those and how they work in context. And then I'm then going to speak to you about how we produce and disseminate findings. And I'm going to talk a very, very small amount about peer-reviewed journal and analysis and the publication process, and how we move from inception and theory to trying to get our research findings out into the main forum. The reason why I'm going to take you through theory all the way up to production and dissemination of findings is to try and offer a solution to the two aims that I've put forwards. So the aim of the session was to offer information and resources which will help you to critically appraise quantitative research studies. But one of the ways I'm going to do that is just to give you an idea about those key methods. I'm going to tell you about those data collection, measurement and analysis methods that we use in quantitative data and data analytics. So what I'm trying to do with the rest of these slides, we've talked about that quantitative research, and I've talked about the different steps that we have. The first steps here are basically that theory generation and hypothesis generation. Hypothesis is just a big word for a research question. For any quantitative statistical analyses, we will always form a null hypothesis. Now that null hypothesis, that something will not happen, stance that we can set to prove or disprove, has to be based on fundamental science and the knowledge that we already have. So you start with a generalised question, and then you start to look at all the literature around which will reveal anything else that other people have found out about that particular research. So what research has been gone on before, what sort of factors can we think about that might actually affect our research area, the search general question. So step 1 and step 2 of quantitative research is about generating a theory and then organising a hypothesis or a research sort of stance that we're going to take. So then we can test that stance to see whether or not it fits or doesn't. Let's put that into a question now. So the first sort of general idea that we have to generate our theory are, do vaccinations against COVID-19 work to minimise rates of infection in a certain population? And we can start to look at that. And what we would start to do is do that systematic literature review. We'd start looking at grey literature. We'd look at the MHRA or equivalent, the FDA or the European Medicines Compendium or whatever else that we wanted to look at. We would collect all the data to identify all of the variables that actually would affect whether or not vaccinations work. This is really, really important. It's the grounding to your quantitative data analysis and your quantitative research methodology. But the first thing that we have to do is start to think, okay, so now we know about vaccinations, we know about COVID-19, we know about lots of different things that might affect vaccinations and whether or not they work, whether or not they don't, and whatever else, but we need to capture that. We need a thing to test. So our hypothesis our question that we set for the research is this, I've just made this company up, so Astra Ross Pfizer company vaccination is effective against COVID-19 rates of infection. That's the stance that we're going to try and look at. So we think we've generated this theory from all of our literature review and our systematic analysis of all of the evidence out there that Astra-Roche Pfizer company vaccination is actually effective against COVID rates of infection. Not a very good question, I'll grant you that, but it's something just to give you an idea about hypothesis versus no hypothesis. That's only one thing. If it's effective against COVID-19 rates of infection, that's either a yes or a no answer, and that doesn't give us enough to go on. It doesn't give us enough to start thinking about what or not we're going to start to evaluate and review and test efficacy and review all of the other sort of things that are happening around that Astra-Ross Pfizer vaccination. What we do instead is we set a null hypothesis, and our null hypothesis can be tested, and it'll tell us whether or not it has an effect, how much effect it's got, what it's all about, what types of effect does it have. And with that null hypothesis, it opens up that research question to so much more data. It gives us the positives and negatives of the effects. So it's not necessarily just whether or not it's going to increase or decrease. It's going to increase rates of infection, but also whether it's going to decrease, more importantly, rates of infection. So what we always do with quantitative data analytics is set a null hypothesis so that we can test. And this is really important, because I'll talk to you later about type 1 and type 2 errors and whether or not we reject a null hypothesis or accept a null hypothesis well or not so well. So the next phase when you're doing a quantitative research piece is just to start thinking about the design, and what you're looking at first of all is what sort of timeline are you looking at? Are we going to look from a retrospective design, so something that brings data in from the past, something that's prospective, something that might well be an intention to collect data in the future, or something more cross-sectional, so something that's analysing real-time data in the present? The study can either be descriptive, experimental, quasi-experimental, or correlational. So descriptive, for example, we could look at something like levels of anxiety in parents in NICU during their step down to discharge. We could look at experimental, which actually would offer an intervention. So an experiment would be an experiment of an intervention, which would, for example, we could use something like, what effect does drug X have on the serum bilirubin levels in neonates? There's also quasi-experimental as well, which would involve an intervention. So, for example, what effect does teaching parentcraft have on eventual parenting? And there we're looking at pre- and post-test designs. Same sample population, you test them beforehand, you give the intervention, you test them afterwards. Or there's correlational. And that's a study where we start to look at relationships between the things that are going on, between the variables that are out there. So this is where we might particularly, for example, look at a study of the relationship between health literacy and adolescent pregnancy, and what are the outcomes of that, and what can we infer from that to be able to see whether or not there's something we can predict or bring forward to surmise our null hypothesis. The setting. Who are you going to choose for your study? How are you going to study them? And where are you going to study them? Is absolutely crucial. It's got to relate to the phenomenon that you are studying. So what I tried to do was just to offer you sort of some information on quantitative research methodology. And I've done that by taking you through the processes and steps that a quantitative researcher would probably start to take. So from theory to hypothesis to design to methods, population sampling, data collection, analysis, and then the production and dissemination of findings. I've also sent you hyperlinks within this whole lecture to try and identify where you can go for further reading, but please feel free to contact me as well anytime you want to, ask questions, what I want to try and do is get you to realise that quantitative research and quantitative statistics are absolutely essential to any healthcare research. They offer a brilliant toolkit for us to be able to analyse our effectiveness, to be able to identify and predict what's best for our patients, and to give us a real good sound basis for our research and our clinical practice. So I hope you enjoyed it, and please feel free to contact me, and I've left my numbers in this final slide.